you obviously don't get what's going on. That is an objectively pro-Hamas position by the UN Secretary General. Hamas is using the people of Gaza as a perpetual human shield. How about somebody calling on Hamas to surrender?
Ambassador John Bolton, thank you so much for joining us. We are now recording. Just tell us, first of all, what do you make of the explanation which the Israeli Defense Force has given? And obviously, they've sacked two senior officers.
Well, I think there's obviously still a lot of information that we don't have one way or the other. I hope the Israelis will continue the investigation. And depending on what the facts are, if it warrants, they'll do more than simply dismissing the officers. That they'd consider prosecution. I think that's appropriate. It's certainly what the United States or the UK would do in comparable circumstances, and I think we can expect, and I think the Israelis can expect of themselves, they would do the same.
But do you think it is sufficient that they've come up with this conclusion and sacked these two officers after an investigation which they themselves have carried out?
Well, that's what the United States military would do. We wouldn't contract this to some foreign government to do, and neither would the United Kingdom. I think I can perhaps reveal a dirty little secret about the Israeli military. It's filled with human beings. They make mistakes, and sometimes they do the wrong thing. And you deal with that the way you deal with other instances where a military member violates their training and doctrine, prosecute them if warranted, or remove them for negligence if nothing else. The argument that somehow this reflects a larger problem with the Israeli military operation in Gaza, to me, remains totally unproven. Even after Biden's conversation with Netanyahu, the continuing, ongoing State and Defense Department review of Israeli military activity has come up with nothing else that indicates any possible violation of the conventions of armed conflict. And they've said this just within a past few days from the podium at the State Department. So if somebody has evidence of violations of the training and doctrine that America or Britain would put on their own people and that we apply to Israel because we're supplying them with weapon systems, let's hear it. Let's not hear these generalized complaints about what's happening in Gaza and blame them on Israel. How about somebody blaming them on the real cause, which is Hamas?
Except that the World Food Kitchen itself, the charity whose members were killed in this strike, have said that it's not really sufficient for Israel to investigate itself, that there should be more independent oversight or more independent way of looking into exactly what happened when we know that there are usually these agreed routes, aren't there, for aid convoys?
Yeah, and I'll just say it again. People can do bad things. That happens. And if it does, those people should be prosecuted. There is not a sovereign military in the world, including yours, that would agree to some independent investigation in this kind of circumstance. The United States would never do that. And the idea we're going to insist that Israel do it because of this tragedy to one NGO, it is a tragedy. There's no doubt about it. It doesn't entitle them to different treatment than everybody else.
Let me ask you about the question of arms supplies to Israel, because in that pretty forthright conversation which President Biden had with Benjamin Netanyahu, he made it clear that unless they opened up this investigation, and indeed if they didn't let in more aid supplies into Gaza, then that could affect weapons supplies to Israel. Do you think that the US should just continue to supply weapons to Benjamin Netanyahu when we look at the scale of the loss of life that there is in Gaza?
Yeah, the scale of the loss of life has to be taken. To complain about it has to be taken with proof of evidence of violation of the law of armed conflict. U.S. experts at West Point and elsewhere that have followed the conflict in Gaza have said publicly that Israel has done more than is called for to minimize the loss of human life. The statistics indicate that the loss in Gaza is roughly comparable to the loss of civilian life in the American-Iraqi effort to retake Fallujah and Mosul from the terrorist ISIS. This idea that somehow there's something extraordinary going on in Gaza is simply not proven. And I think the continued supply of arms to an ally who has been attacked by terrorists and is exercising its inherent right of self-defense is something we should continue. I mean, what people are proposing, in effect, is to take Hamas's side and to take a terrorist group that is cynically and barbarically exposing its own people, using them as human shields in an effort to be so debased to protect themselves from Israel's right of self-defense. And I
But
think
there
this
is
terrorist
pressure, for
veto
example,
is a war crime itself.
But there is pressure on the British government here to halt arms supplies to Israel because those campaigning for this say the Israelis are simply not letting in sufficient aid supplies. Even with those additional routes that are being opened up, we know that there are tens of thousands of people there at risk of starvation.
And who is responsible? The government of Gaza is responsible because it launched this war on October the 7th. This is something that demonstrates the barbarity of Hamas, that if it not only can kill, rape, and torture Israelis, it can expose its own people to death and wounding in order to protect itself, and to take the view that Israel has to limit its military operations because of Hamas's brutality to its own people is to turn the logic of humanitarian law on its head.
So when you hear Antonio Guterres of the United Nations saying that there are systemic problems in the way that Israel is prosecuting this war, that there are systemic problems and that there should be a humanitarian ceasefire, a prolonged one, to allow in decent amounts of aid. And when we hear that aid agencies are saying they're still not getting in even enough basic supplies to keep people alive, does that not mean that the United States should do more to put more pressure on Israel on this question?
I'm sorry I'm not being articulate enough here. You obviously don't get what's going on. That is an objectively pro-Hamas position by the UN Secretary General. Hamas is using the people of Gaza as a perpetual human shield. How about somebody calling on Hamas to surrender? You want to end the war in Gaza? You want to end the threat of terrorism? Why doesn't Hamas surrender? And for British people listening to this program, I urge you to read the Potsdam Declaration, issued in 1945 by Prime Minister Churchill and President Truman, addressed to the Empire of Japan. Read the Potsdam Declaration, look at what Winston Churchill and Harry Truman said about what Japan should do, and then, if you're worried about Israel, go back and look at your own history.
Ambassador John Bolton, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much.